Hello, this is Eleanor with Audible Local Ledger. It's March 18th, 2025. Today I'll be reading an article from Vanity Fair. Confidential. Along with a contingent of detectives and undercover operatives, the NYPD's County Terror Czar, Rebecca Weiner, defends New York City and the nation against enemies foreign and domestic. Adam Soralski reports from inside the country's most elite local law enforcement agency. On a cloudless September afternoon, I stopped by One Police Plaza in Lower Manhattan to see Rebecca Ulam Weiner, an enigmatic figure who occupies one of the most consequential and improbable perches in America's national security hierarchy. As the NYPD's Deputy Commissioner of Intelligence and Counterterrorism, her chief mission is to counter terrorism and mitigate targeted violence, fight crime, and protect people, places, and events in New York City. And that's not the half of it. As part of her sprawling portfolio, the 47-year-old mother of two relies on a mind-boggling suite of assets that Americans might otherwise assume are controlled by the CIA, FBI, DHS, Secret Service, or other agencies. Weiner has access to a legion of intelligence analysts, counter-assault and dignitary protection teams, a flotilla of boats, radiation sniffing and surveillance aircraft, the nation's biggest bomb squad, a counter-drone unit, a remote contingent of NYPD detectives stationed in 13 cities overseas, and a network of multilingual undercover operatives who subvert malicious actors across the U.S. and around the world. Dubbed Intel, or ICB for short, the Intelligence and Counterterrorism Bureau was forged from the fires of 9/11. For more than a decade, its members drew scorn from and fought turf wars with America's spooks and special agents. But after helping foil more than 60 terrorist plots, Weiner's squad has made a quantum leap from deeply controversial to positively indispensable. NYPD Intel disrupts terror attacks, runs undercover operations, and disseminates threat assessments and flash reports to its sister agencies as well as foreign intelligence services, offering expertise and muscle for cases as varied as mystery drones flying over the tri-state area and December's fatal shooting of United Healthcare CEO in Midtown. In August, I approached her team with the idea of chronicling its operations. Just on the horizon loomed the annual 9/11 commemoration, the first anniversary of Hamas's October 7 attack on Israel, and the violence and upheaval it wrought, and a highly contentious U.S. election. The NYPD agreed, citing the volume of threats facing New York and the country and the department's unique role in combating them. When I arrived at her 11th floor office, Rena was sporting a baby blue pin on her lapel, a vestige of the September 11 ceremony at the World Trade Center memorial she had attended and helped secure earlier in the day. As we sat in her inner sanctum, surrounded by diplomas, Harvard College, Harvard Law, assorted law enforcement tchotchkes, and her young kids' artwork, events in Ukraine and the Middle East conspired to make it feel as though the world were spinning off its axis. At the same moment, 3 floors above, her boss, Police Commissioner Edward Caban, was about to resign under pressure from his boss, Mayor Eric Adams, who would soon be indicted. Shortly thereafter, Caban's replacement, Tom Donlin, would fall under federal investigation as well. The machinations inside the cloistered halls of 1PP and Gracie Mansion, however, paled in comparison to what was happening on the streets. An ISIS-inspired plot to murder Jews in Brooklyn had just been stymied. That was on the heels of an arrest in New York, L.A., and Philly of a group of Tajik men with alleged ISIS ties who had come across the Mexican border. Meanwhile, Weiner and her team were on the lookout for Iranian agents prowling the city and actively planning to assassinate dissidents and former U.S. officials. The variety of threats we have right now, Weiner observed, are unprecedented in the 20 years I've been in this work. Whether they know it or not, New Yorkers and Americans across the land are now standing on X, is what security specialists refer to as a position of maximum vulnerability. In no small measure, safeguarding America's financial and cultural capital rests on the shoulder of a 5'5" national security prodigy with a backstory that is the stuff of cinema. If you didn't have a Rebecca Weiner, you would have had to make her up, her predecessor said. How her life has come full circle. Her grandfather fled Poland ahead of the Nazi invasion and was soon contacted by a mathematician who suggested he relocate to New Mexico for, quote, war work. Nothing further was explained. He checked out a book at the library and was able to determine that the U.S. was working on a fission device. He collaborated closely with Edward Teller on the hydrogen bomb, which cycled through various nicknames, including Super, Ivy Mike, and the Teller-Ulam design. Her grandfather's achievements at work did not always sit well at home. She said her grandmother grew disenchanted with America's ongoing nuclear enterprise in the wake of the devastating A-bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It seems that whatever her grandfather considered elegant solutions to thorny math and physics problems, his wife viewed as unacceptable, or at least troubling, moral choices. While a Harvard undergrad, Weiner studied the impact that women had on the Manhattan Project, and last year wrote about her family's unique dynamic dilemmas. May vividly recounted the moment she came across my grandfather sitting in the kitchen one day, staring blindly into their garden. I found a way to make it work, he said. It's a totally different scheme, and it will change the course of history. Pulling no punches, Weiner noted, when the U.S. tested Ivy Mike, the first hydrogen bomb built using the new design, it vaporized an entire South Pacific island. In our conversations, it was evident that the New Mexico native has internalized the lessons of her lineage. She needs no reminder that with great power comes great responsibility. In a way, she is so laser-focused, she seems unfazed by the battles within New York City or NYPD and politics. Given the relentless pace and tremendous stakes of her job, I was also struck by her breezy demeanor and wicked sense of humor. She burst out laughing when I asked her to comment on Miller's observation about her. Somewhere there's a strange corollary between building the bomb that was meant to bring peace in the Manhattan Project to being in charge of the project that keeps bombs out of a place called Manhattan. Ribbing her friend and former boss, she replied, "That's the insight you have as you're eating Cool Ranch Doritos after smoking way too much pot." Ruminating further on the historical and personal through line, Weiner said, "I like the leitmotif. Yeah, they think it was going to end war. Well, hopefully I'll have more success keeping the bombs out of Manhattan than the Manhattan Project had making a bomb to keep peace forevermore." Such offhand acuity is part of her makeup. Weiner is poised, cultivated, pin-sharp, convivial, boundlessly curious, charmingly profane, a lightning-quick study, and at times a person possessed. At one point, as we discussed her unit's close cooperation with Scotland Yard, I learned that she had spent 18 years helping bring to justice a seemingly untouchable ISIS recruiter in the UK. When I asked a top U.S. diplomat for his read on Weiner, he called her the real deal, an assessment based in no small measure on where he's run into her at national security conferences. When I hit the hotel gym at 5:30 in the morning, he said, she's always there on the treadmill, only the two of us, and maybe the other guy. She's totally hardcore. In late September, when I went with Weiner and her associates on some unconventional ride-alongs as New York played host to the single largest gathering of world leaders, all of whom had come to town for the annual UN General Assembly, it's a diplomatic spectacle wrapped in a security nightmare. There are lots of police departments with dignitary teams but ours is scalable, he said of the 60-person unit that every September balloons into the hundreds. Nobody has this size or level of integration and planning. Well, the Met, meaning the Metropolitan Police in London, has the royal family and all, so that's something. As Engel and I chatted outside UN headquarters, Biden had just finished speaking. Due to the recent attempts on Trump's life, law enforcement officials were leading from the front. Weiner, Ronald Rhodes Jr., the acting director of the Secret Service, and senior FBI brass stood a few feet away while heavily armed detachments roamed the plaza. In the distance, a Coast Guard cutter and NYPD counter-assault teams on fast boats patrolled the East River. At that moment, the UN seemed the safest place on Earth and the biggest bullseye. Manhattan was abuzz. Three wartime leaders had converged on the city, and while Netanyahu was in town, he took the opportunity to call in a rather consequential airstrike, eliminating Hezbollah's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, a close Iranian ally. Referring to the potential threats amid the flurry of limos, Weiner said, "You never know what'll show up on your bingo card at a UN gala." General Assembly. Some of the uncertainty stems from the fact that heads of state arrive with their own bodyguards, who are packing a combustible combination of firearms and diplomatic immunity. Under the 1947 Headquarters Agreement, which established the UN as neutral territory, the U.S. is generally obliged to issue visas and facilitate access for member states and avowed enemies. UNGA tests the limits of this rule as well as the patience of national security officials. It is one thing when Britain's Prime Minister travels with an elite protection team. It is quite another when Iran's president is out and about with a phalanx from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, a U.S.-designated terrorist organization. According to senior law enforcement officials and court records, the IRGC, besides training and equipping a murderer's row of malign actors, has been at work on American soil orchestrating a series of brazen murder-for-hire schemes to avenge one of their own. In 2020, a major general was killed in a U.S. drone strike approved by Trump. As commander of the group's elite Quds force, he was the power behind the throne, responsible for maintaining the regime's authoritarian stranglehold at home and overseeing the deadly work of its proxies abroad. His demise sent Tehran into a tailspin and triggered a qualitative change in doctrine. Iran had long been, as Weiner put it, calibrated and retributive. It responded to a strike against a general or a nuclear scientist by targeting somebody of comparable stature among its enemies. Now, she advised understandably, the apertures opened a bit. Iran's stateside plotting pushed ICB into overdrive. Together with the FBI's New York field office, Weiner and her unit helped staff and direct the nation's oldest and largest joint terrorism task force, which includes representatives from some 50 federal, state, and local agencies. Over the last 2 years, increasingly alarming information started coming in suggesting that hitmen hired by Iran were roaming the 5 boroughs. "There's this growing intensity and urgency," Weiner said, of the hunt for these would-be assassins. "We felt like we were chasing ghosts." I did not fully appreciate the extent of Iran's lethal plotting, as Weiner's team calls it, or the obsession it had become for officials in New York, until I sat in for part of Weiner's morning intelligence briefing during UNGA. 10 people gathered around a conference table at one police plaza, and another 20 from various ICB components, along with FBI representatives, piped in on a security video feed. They covered a number of threats quickly, mostly off the record. Then they turned to an unusual incident. The previous evening, an IRGC bodyguard had indicated to authorities that he'd left his weapon at his hotel in Midtown and requested that his security detail retrieve it and bring it to their plane before takeoff. That was a non-starter. Instead, officers went to the hotel room where they found not only a knockoff Glock with 2 loaded magazines, but also an encrypted 2-way radio bearing the words, "Property of the IRGC." Eyes went wide around the room as the group considered the meaning and timing of the incident. Shortly thereafter, as I drove with Weiner to base camp, Netanyahu's heavily armed convoy whizzed by in the opposite direction. She didn't miss a beat, wondering aloud, imagine if the IRGC guy killed somebody. That would have been a big deal. Her team had turned the gun and radio over to the FBI. When I visited the topic with her later, she said, "We are worried about them killing Trump at the same time that we're also being called up from a car and asked to return their property. As my 9-year-old would say, it's very ironical." Hours after the intelligence briefing, Officials in Washington announced a reward for information leading to the arrest or conviction of an IRGC operative who used encrypted internet-based messaging applications to hire criminal elements within the United States to murder a former USG official in Washington, D.C. or Maryland in exchange for $300,000. John Bolton, Trump's former national security advisor, was the unnamed target. But he was hardly the only one. In January, during his first week in office, Trump reportedly ordered that security details be rescinded for Bolton, ex-Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and Pompeo's former deputy Brian Hook, even in the face of apparent ongoing Iranian threats. To understand why Weiner is the consummate heavy for this moment, it helps to understand the story of the unit she now heads and how it fits into her career trajectory. The tale begins, as so many do, on September 11, 2001. It starts with the guy who would eventually hire her a year out of law school. At the time, Dave Cohen was settling into one of life's elusive second acts after 3 decades at the CIA, where he had risen to become the agency's deputy director of operations. It's historically the best job in Washington, he explained. You're the head of America's clandestine service. Nothing matches that. But he and his wife were ready to shift gears, so he took a position in New York as an advisor to Hank Greenberg at the insurance juggernaut AIG, where at long last the stakes were low and the pay was high. Then the Twin Towers were attacked, and Cohen's old life came roaring back with a vengeance. I knew we were at war, he said. After all, in the days when he was America's top spy, 3 years after the first assault on the World Trade Center in '93, he had helped establish the CIA's Bin Laden issue station, later named Alex Station, which was tasked with tracing the tendrils of al-Qaeda. When Michael Bloomberg was elected mayor in late 2001, he appointed Ray Kelly to his second stint as NYPD commissioner. Kelly was already familiar with a landscape that, in lower Manhattan anyway, had become a hellscape. Bloomberg, in fact, plucked Kelly from his own cushy gig at Bear Stearns, where he had reported to CEO Ace Greenberg. As crews raced around the clock to recover remains from Ground Zero, Kelly reached out to Cohen, who recalled that Kelly cut to the chase. He said, "I'm going to rebuild the NYPD to deal with the terrorist threat, and I'd like you to come in and join me." Pushing back politely, Cohen insisted he didn't want to leave his new boss, Hank Greenberg, hanging. But Kelly wasn't having it. Cohen laughed. Without missing a beat, he said, yeah, you have your Greenberg problems, I have mine. The former spy chief felt obligated. With the city still smoldering, he knew he had 2 options: take the job or leave town. In January 2002, the CIA veteran took over an intelligence unit that originated in the early 1900s. It was pretty much an armpit, he recounted. The most important thing that ever came out of it was where Elvis Presley, who was drafted into the Army, was deployed from when he went to Germany. But even a star turn could not mask the obvious. NYPD intel was a world away from the department's center of gravity across the river in Manhattan. When Cohen finally finagled an office at One Police Place, the administrative overlords relegated the former spy chief to room 301, a storage area chock full of investigative reports dating back to 1901. He squeezed into a space that was, in his words, closet-sized, barely big enough for a desk and a handful of chairs. I treated it as a status symbol. I didn't want to meld in with the rest of the department. It was important to sustain the mystique. But he had something that most of the brass did not, the commissioner's ear. Every day he had a standing 8 a.m. appointment with Kelly, and everyone knew it. Proximity to power only amplified his cachet. He and his boss had a mindset of building the agency along the lines of the OSS, Cohen told me, referring to the Office of Strategic Services, the CIA's nimble World War II predecessor. We're going to have an analytical program, an operational program, a deep cover program. As needs arose, he would add a cyber capability, a surveillance capability. All of these were sort of bricks on a wall. It was a complete paradigm shift. Mitch Silber, one of Cohen's early hires who became his director of intelligence analysis, explained, historically, in a police department, the motto is collars for dollars. You bring a case for prosecution, and then you get promoted, and then you get more dollars. So the idea that you would run a long-term intelligence collection investigation for a few years, and therefore there would be no callers, and therefore there would be no dollars, was a shock to the culture. Cohen's bureau placed a premium on human intelligence derived from undercover officers and confidential informants, the collection of open-source intelligence, and a strong team of analysts to make sense of it all. He quickly recognized the built-in advantage of a department that could draw on 36,000 cops conversant in 168 languages. His crown jewel, though, was the Special Services Unit, a group whose name has never been disclosed in the mainstream press. They were the pointy end of the spear, he said. The deep cover program enabled you to get inside the operations of a terror cell. By design, it was a separate and stealthy enterprise. Cohen and Company scoured applications from the post-9/11 legions looking to join the NYPD and plucked individuals from non-traditional backgrounds who, in spy jargon, could live their cover. Once selected, they were never allowed to walk into an NYPD facility. We didn't want them to learn police jargon. We didn't want them going to dinner, say with assets or targets, and asking for a receipt. No, you don't need a receipt if you're coming with us. There were Afghans, Pakistanis, Egyptians, you name it. We took full advantage in a positive way of what the city had to offer. The unit quickly encountered resistance from a formidable opponent, the FBI. Though the NYPD and the Bureau had worked together for ages, Kelly needed a team he could run and trust post-9/11. From our vantage, Silber recalled, the feds had failed in '93 and in 2001. If there was another plot, we feared there would be a massive capital flight from the city. To be fair, the FBI had already been thoroughly excoriated for its failure to connect the 9/11 dots or play nice with other government agencies. The CIA had also been taken to the woodshed for siloing critical information that might have thwarted or blunted the attack. Cohen's outfit ruffled feathers among Washington's national security set, nowhere more so than at the FBI. Skirmishes over information sharing metastasized into turf battles. We were intruders into their area of responsibility, Cohen said. But they couldn't do what we could do. The disparity was glaring. In the early aughts, the FBI had roughly 12,000 special agents spread across 56 domestic field offices and 45 U.S. posts abroad. In contrast, the NYPD had 3 times as many officers operating within the 5 boroughs alone. Things came to a head in August of 2004 when a confidential informant secretly recorded 2 men plotting to bomb the Herald Square substation. We actually stopped a terrorist attack, Cohen said. The Bureau didn't take it seriously. They were wrong. They didn't think we could do it. They were wrong. And this was like 2 weeks before the Republican National Convention a couple of blocks away. This was a big, big deal. The primary defendant was sentenced to 30 years for conspiring to plant explosives. That was really the first case, Silber noted, that proved that the NYPD Intelligence Division could bring value to that was unique and distinct. Weiner fit neatly into this scrappy yet evolving team. In 2006, as a Harvard International Security Fellow, she was writing a paper on the risks government faced by outsourcing to private military contractors. One day she happened to attend a panel called Policing in a Time of Terror. Ray Kelly was among the participants and mentioned the unit that he and Cohen had set up. After the talk, Weiner approached him and said she wanted to work there. The next day she got a call and Cohen brought her on as an intelligence analyst. In short order, she found herself in a cop shop, armed with a law degree and her expertise in foreign affairs, biotech, and nuclear deterrence, as well as her knowledge of the threat posed by radical Islamist groups and the so-called lone wolves they helped to inspire. Cohen's tenure was not without controversy. Perhaps one of his most audacious gambits, which happened to dovetail with Weiner's interest, occurred sub rosa. He quietly established a program to place detectives in key locations overseas. Their role was to provide intelligence on ever-changing terror tactics, as well as early warnings of potential threats to the city. From his CIA days, Cohen had strong relationships with foreign intelligence and law enforcement officials and knew plenty of American ambassadors. Even so, he realized that putting members of a metropolitan police force in a U.S. embassy or anywhere in a foreign country would draw fire from the feds. But having come from a world where risk was rewarded, he went for it. Cohen, in an early instance, persuaded Spain's national police to host a hard-charging young detective who spoke impeccable Castilian Spanish. They agreed, but evidently made the mistake of calling U.S. embassy officials to see if they would mind. Cohen grimaced as he recalled the earful Madrid got from an American diplomat. "Absolutely we mind. Don't do it." When Cohen broke the news to Kelly, Cohen remembered the commissioner didn't bat an eye. He purportedly barked, "Send 'em anyway." Today, the NYPD has liaison officers in cities from Abu Dhabi to Bogota, The Hague to Tel Aviv, and Weiner has been a linchpin. She helped foreign counterparts track cells or crack cases, created an intel and threat analysis program that would become an industry model, and became the first senior member of a local police force to serve on America's National Intelligence Council. In 2014, Cohen handed over the reins to John Miller, now CNN's chief law enforcement and intelligence analyst, who knew the terrain. As a senior FBI official, he'd witnessed the acrimony between the department and the feds. Steeped in both cultures, he spearheaded an effort to get the cops and the G-men, as he put it, to stop knocking heads. Under Miller, the FBI began ramping up its use of SSU's pool of undercovers. Federal agents tended to be older, more square. Miller's, and now Weiner's, were younger, more diverse, multilingual. The FBI's former special agent in charge of counterterrorism in New York, Brian Parman, gave me the rationale. Your average FBI agent is hired around age 30. By the time he has his investigative chops and has gone through undercover school and is certified, he may be closer to early 40s. But if you're talking about a group of young radicals, how do you infiltrate when those guys are 22? The answer? Tap into NYPD's ranks. Over time, that collaboration, almost entirely invisible to the public, expanded nationwide. We started to cross-certify our undercovers into their program, Miller said. We became basically an extension of the efforts to protect other American cities from terrorism. By this point, with the FBI in the lead, the NYPD's undercover traveled to meet the suspect in person. He told us he's looking to carry out an attack on this outdoor pedestrian area in Dallas. Weiner continued. Moving quickly, Miller said, the FBI took the guy down on the road because they said, we've got too much threat, too much capability. The case, he noted, was a prime example of a fast-moving plot that looked like it was imminent and had to be stopped, and where the only person who could get into the guy was the NYPD undercover. The main question ended up pleading to a charge of conspiracy to distribute narcotics and will spend years behind bars. While ISIS was a constant worry, so too were new threats from potential attackers aligned with Iran. An apprescient move, Miller asked Weiner, then his director of intelligence analysis, with charging Iran's capabilities on the ground in New York City. He remembered being struck that she came up with this brilliant report which strung together all of these connections that, had the federal government done it, would have been highly classified. But it was all based on NYPD casework, our first clear look into what Iran was up to with Hezbollah and other operators mapping targets in New York. It was only a matter of time before Weiner's hour would arrive. In July of 23, during a delicate politicized period, she emerged as a consensus candidate to be Miller's successor. In appointing her, Mayor Adams noted that protecting the nation was in her blood. Today she is following in her grandfather's legacy in protecting our city and our nation's security. This is the American dream. Again, you are listening to Audible Local Ledger from March 18th, an article from Vanity Fair. This has been part 1 of that article. Stay tuned next week for part 2. Thanks for listening.